Are we waiting like 5-10 minutes? How's it been going in terms of the timing for people to trickle in? Or are we going right
We started about 5 minutes late,
okay.
but not too many people trickled in, really,
Okay.
so you're good either way.
Okay. But we just welcome people as they come in. Great. So just want to say hi to everyone today. I'm Jeb Middlebrook. I'm an assistant professor at Cal State Dominguez Hills. And we have a really exciting panel for you today. Black realities, black change, blackness in hip-hop, evictions, and prison. This panel actually emerged from conversations among myself and the panelists, Nana Flippin and Oliver John Baptiste, in the master's program in sociology at California State Dominguez Hills, where Oliver completed his master's last May, and Nana's a current student, an MA student as well. The format, we're going to each offer a talk, maybe 12 to 15 minutes each, and then what we wanted to offer was a roundtable discussion among us as panelists specifically to connect some of the threads thematically that we're discussing and really have a free-form discussion, and then we'll open it up to the audience for the last half hour to have a collaborative discussion. But we realize that we're in dialogue a lot among ourselves, and we wanted to really have that space to deepen that dialogue off the page in sort of more formal roundtable side. So we had about 45 minutes of presentation, 30 minutes of roundtable, and then we'll have 30 minutes for Q&A. So the first speaker will be Lanana Flippin, and as I mentioned, he's an MA candidate in sociology at Cal State Dominguez Hills. He's presenting from his research talk titled From Blackness to Hip Hop, Africanness, Indigeneity, and Universality. Thank you.
My first time up here. I'm a little nervous, but I guess we're here. Give yourselves a round of applause. Alright, let's get this started right. So this is my second semester. I'm going to be talking about blackness into hip hop, African indigeneity, resonance, and hip hop culture. I'm going to read this first, and then during the discussion, have questions, if you guys have anything to ask. But so the topic of my discussion will be the exploration of blackness, its roots in African indigeneity, all the way to its manifestations of hip-hop. The purpose of this work is to raise awareness about the power of what I like to call community consciousness. In other words, hip-hop. From the beginning of time, human beings have developed themselves from communities to societies to nations. All along, the thing that makes us human is the social act of life, the way we interact with each other, the day-to-day things, the way we communicate. I say all that to say that our ancestors were in tune with the order and magic of nature and integrated this knowledge with everyday life through rites and rituals. They carried on the history of peoples for traditions and for generations and provided a way of life that was in unison with their identity and their place in nature. But most importantly, it was their direct line to their ancestors and God. The Maasai in East Africa, which is where my mother is from, and where I actually had my first experience with circle practices, and where I started to associate the similarities between hip-hop and African indigenous cultures. So the Maasai in East Africa, the Griotes and the Griots of West Africa, and the Dogon of Mali all have circle practices that parallel African diaspora circle practices that also parallel b-boy ciphers in hip-hop. A British journalist, David Troop, utilized an African cultural survivals approach which highlighted direct linkages between New York City MCs and griots of West Africa. If you look at Kool Herc, who is supposedly, coined or crowned the founder of hip-hop, he talks about his Jamaican roots and that having a contribution to his DJing when he started DJing in hip-hop. Africa Bambaataa also references his Jamaican roots and his Jamaican lineage to the creation of the philosophies of hip-hop, the 5 elements, specifically knowledge of self. So circle practice have a spiritual element as well. It's an unseen driving force behind b-boy ciphers in hip-hop. So ciphering practices in general enact the presence of an extra-phenomenal force, sometimes described as energy, other times as a high, and other times as a spiritual connection. I call it vibrational frequency. I didn't make that up, by the way. Somebody else said that's a scientific term. So Imani Kai Johnson does an excellent and beautiful description of this force, and she calls it dark matter. She describes it as the non-luminous material glue that holds together galaxies and appears only by way of its gravitational influence on surrounding visible matter. She also notes its parallels to other circle practices, particularly in African diaspora, like ring shouts, the capoeira, the bombas. These are all examples of b-boying ciphers and African indigeneity. And you see it everywhere in the world. It's not just Africa. Any indigenous culture in the world has practiced this. This is what human beings have always done. The spiritual element has kind of been thrown out the window as history has gone out. It's kind of been written off as spookism, but it's not. And anybody who's any hip hoppers in here? Hip hoppers, hands up. Hip hoppers. You've seen ciphers. You've seen the magic. It's not. It's very real. You know, your people get in trance. It's a very real thing. She uses dark matter as a metaphor for this multidimensional force that acts as the presence of possibility for self-expression, release, spiritual connection, or a sense of liberation, even if only momentarily. Now, just to step out of the cipher and heading into the real world, in this case, I'll have to start with slavery and how slavery develops into the civil rights movement of a people whose philosophy and newfound knowledge of self later came to define their identity. This is what blackness is. So first, in response to the conditions of colonialism, slaves have had to consolidate all of their different spiritual practices into one system. So for example, in the slave trade, like all of the Africans that were brought over, a lot of them had different spiritual practices. It's not like people have this idea that Africa is this monolithic place that everybody kind of just prays to one God, and it's a very diverse and a very, very different, depending on where you are, it's a very diverse place. Different spiritual practices. So through slavery, slaves were forced to practice in secret. So they couldn't really openly practice their spirituality. So that, what they had to do is consolidate them and turn it into one uniform spiritual system. Some people call it voodoo. It's really Vodun, and what it means is introspect into the unknown. But it's been written off as like spookism. So this process of consolidation, you know, had manifested into blackness, and even later on into what we call hip-hop today. You know, taking what you have and kind of making something with it. So black people fought for their rights to vote and be recognized as real Americans alongside their white counterparts. This atmosphere created subcultures and genres for liberal artistic expression, where we start to see an accumulation of customs and practices expressed by black people in their efforts to survive and be seen and heard as valid members of society. So the civil rights established a way for black people to mobilize social, political, and economic resources, but they were still kept at the margins. So this era brought in like an attitude, a new attitude for black people. It inspired confidence, independence, and self-reliance. These same conditions and attitudes produced some of the greatest artists and ideas in American history. You know, these are the conditions that produced the W.E.B. Du Boises and the double consciousness. This is when people started to wake up to their reality and see themselves in their own eyes. You know, you had the artistic expression of people like Maya Angelou. You know, Marian Anderson was a black opera singer in the early 1920s. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. She was a beautiful singer. James Brown, you know, the godfather of soul. If you talk to anybody that was, you know, present in that time, they will tell you how electric